Good morning. Today I'll be your host, Ariel Morales, and I'm here to welcome you to my Part 2 summary and theme analysis from the story To Kill A Mockingbird. First, I'm going to give you a little recap of what Part 1 is about, move on to Part 2, give my two themes in the story, and then just explain a little summary in the chapters for Part 2. So in Part 2, it focuses on the children and how their innocence is still with them. They get to enjoy their childhood and that adult problems wouldn't enter in their lives yet. But as the story goes along in part 1, the kids soon see and feel what racism is and how it affects their feelings and how it can also affect a person. They end up learning some valuable lessons throughout the story, but with those lessons, it was created due to social poverty, racism, and controlling who you are as a person. So this is a little brief summary of part 1, which is again about the children and their innocence, but will soon end up getting disrupted by racism around their neighborhood and adult problems. So now I'll be moving on to part 2. In part 2, it is now about Atticus defending a man named Tom Robinson, which creates racism with the whites in the community that ends up creeping into Scout and Jem's world. In part 2, it is also known that Jem starts to separate from Scout more and more because of how his maturation is different than Scout's because he understands the trial of Tom Robinson at his age than Scout does. Jill is brought back into the story to be with Jem and Scout to experience the trial with them. And Aunt Alexandra comes back as well, but this time she lives with Jem and Scout. With her living there, she becomes someone who contrasts Atticus's way of thinking where he rejects a person's superiority over another, whether it's race or from the family tree. In part 2, the scene is concentrated more into the trial in the story to expose the racism in the town and that racism is unreasonable and has unjustified biases. We soon then get to know who Tom is, which is that he's a kind man and a giving family man who happens to be crippled and that the accusations against him are laughable. The accusers are the family of the Ewells. They are disliked in the town because they live off the goodwill and charity of the town and government. The father, who is the accuser in the trial against Tom Robinson, is Bob Ewell. He is a loathsome man who puts his love of alcohol above his children and their needs, who also doesn't care about letting a man to die in the fault to die to protect a false pride in his family. In fact, in the story, he is also someone who relies on his skin color in the story to show that he is telling the truth. In the story, we, the audience, know that Tom is innocent and not blinded. Tom is innocent. But in the story, only a few adults and the children are the only ones who know that Tom is innocent and not blinded by racism. Towards the end of the trial, Atticus's closing speech is a powerful message / accusations against the South racism and that would choose wrong over the right because simply of the skin color. As the trial dims down, the story goes back to the children's world. But as the story goes on, we can see that Jem and Scout has matured a lot over time by the main lessons that Atticus has given them. Now I'll be talking about my two themes in the story, which are racial prejudice and social snobbery. With racial prejudice, it gets highlighted in some of the story in part 1, but throughout the whole story, it is mostly shown during the trial. With the racial prejudice, it corrupts the minds of the town's citizens, however the kids are safe and free from the prejudice. Following along with the racial prejudice comes along with the social snobbery. With this snobbery, it doesn't allow Mayella Ewell, the daughter of Bob Ewell, to seek companionship with anyone and can lead a normal life. This makes Scout not be able to befriend Walter Cunningham Jr. because of how Aunt Alexandra is conscious of difference in class, and how even African Americans were stopped from mingling with whites and are not given even educational or financial opportunities. So now I'll be talking about some summaries in the chapters of part 2. So in chapter 12 and 13, summer begins where Jem is now too old to be bothered by his little sister, which causes Scout great dismay to add to Scout's disappointment. To add to Scout's disappointment, Dill won't be coming to make home this summer, although Capernia eases her loneliness somewhat. With Atticus at a special session of the state legislature, Capernia takes the children to her church. Upon their return from the church, they find Aunt Alexandra waiting on the porch for them. She announces that at Atticus's request, she's coming to live with them for a while. Aunt Alexandra comes to great pains to educate the children in the importance of the finch breeding, going as far as to have Atticus deliver an uncharacteristic speech, a speech he ultimately recants to Scout and Jem. In chapters 14 through 16, Scout innocently recounts her trip to Calpurnia's church for Atticus. Aunt Alexandra is mortified and vehemently refuses Scout's request to go to Calpurnia's house. With Scout out of the room, she comments that she really doesn't need a housekeeper now that she has come to stay, recommending that Atticus let Calpurnia go. Now it's Atticus's turn to vehemently deny Alexandra's request. Jem and Scout retreat to let the adults work out their differences, but end up in a fist fight with each other. Sent to bed early, Jem and Scout get themselves ready to sleep. Crossing the floor in a darkened room, Scout feels like what she thinks is a snake. Jem discovers that the snake is Dill with a fantastic story of his runaway voyage to Maycomb. Jem calls Atticus, who arranges for Dill to spend the night. In chapters 17 to 20, that's when the trial begins. Hecate, which is the county sheriff, is the first witness. Under cross-examination, he admits that a doctor was never called to the scene to examine Mayella Ewell. Bob Ewell takes a stand next and causes a stir, but Atticus carefully plants the seed that Mr. Ewell himself would have beaten Mayella. Mayella takes the stand next. Even though Atticus believes that she is lying, he treats her with courtesy and respect. Mayella thinks that he is making fun of her though. Her testimony soon proves that Mayella is unused and gentility and common courtesy. Atticus asks Tom to stand up so that Mayella may identify him. As he does, Scout notices that Tom's left arm is withered and useless. He could not have committed the crime in the way it was described. The state rests its case. Atticus calls only one witness, Tom Robinson. Tom tells the true story, being careful all the while not to come right out and say that Mayella is lying. However, Tom makes a fatal error when he admits under cross-examination that he, a black man, felt sorry for Mayella Ewell. Dill has a very emotional response to Mr. Gilmer's questioning and leaves the courtroom in tears. Scout follows Dill outside where they talk about Adolphus Raymond, who reveals the secret behind his brown bag and his drinking. Scout and Dill return to the courtroom in time to hear the last half of Atticus's impassioned speech to the jury. Just as Atticus finishes, Calpurnia walks into the courtroom and heads toward Atticus. In chapters 21 through 23, Calpurnia brings a note telling Atticus that Scout and Jem are missing, which causes him great concern until Mr. Underwood tells him that the children are in the courtroom, in the colored balcony. Calpurnia scolds the children all the way home, but Atticus says that they can return to hear the jury's verdict. Jem is convinced that the jury will acquit Tom Robinson after the evidence Atticus presented. After the verdict, Jem leaves the courtroom stunned, angry, and crying. The African American community loads the Finch family with food for defending Tom so valiantly, which surprises the children because Atticus didn't win. Atticus tells Jem not to be disheartened because he will appeal Tom's case, and they stand a much better chance of winning on appeal. The neighborhood is abuzz with talk of the trial, and Miss Stephanie questions the children relentlessly until Miss Monty sides with Atticus and puts an end to the discussion. In chapters 24 through 26, Aunt Alexandra invites Scout to attend her missionary society meeting. Scout helps Calpurnia serve refreshments and tries to join the ladies in conversation. The women, with the exception of Miss Monty, gently corner Scout with their questions, taking a great delight in her responses. Just about the time Scout decides that she prefers the company of men, Atticus interrupts the meeting with the news that Tom Robinson had been killed in an attempted escape. In the kitchen, Atticus asks Calpurnia to accompany him to give the news to Tom's wife, Helen. Aunt Alexandra's almost apologetic for Atticus, but Miss Monty takes her task defending him. Scout rejoins the party with Aunt Alexandra and Miss Molly, determined to act like a lady in the face of grim circumstances. Helen takes the news about Tom badly. The rest of Maycomb has mixed reactions. Bob Ewell is vocal about his glee at Tom's death, saying, "It made one down and about two more to go." In chapters 27 and 28, things settle down in Maycomb, although Bob Ewell publicly blames Atticus for him losing his job. Tom Robinson's old boss, Link Dees, gives Helen a job, but Bob Ewell makes it very difficult for her to safely walk to work. Dees puts an end to that, which makes Ewell angry. The ladies of Maycomb decide to organize a Halloween pageant in the high school auditorium this year. Scott is assigned the role of a ham. She has a great costume for the peanut, but she can't get out of her ham suit without help. And towards the last three chapters, Scout recounts what happened, realizing that one of the strange noises she heard was Jem's arm breaking. The sheriff notices knife marks on Scout's costume, and she understands that Bob Ewell had intended to kill her and Jem. She also recognizes that the stranger, the man who pulled Ewell off of her and saved both the children's lives, is Boo Radley. Scout, Atticus, Hecate, and Boo retire to the front porch. Atticus begins defending Jem, insisting that killing Bob Ewell was clearly self-defense. Sheriff Tate corrects Atticus, saying that Bob Ewell fell on his own knife. Atticus appreciates what Hecate is trying to do, but he does not want anyone to cover for Jem. The sheriff remains adamant, saying that he isn't protecting Jem. As the men argue, Atticus realizes that Boo Radley killed Ewell, and that it is Boo who Tate is trying to protect. They finally agree that Ewell did not fall on his own knife, a decision Scout fully understands. Boo sees Jem one more time and then asks Scout to take him home. Scout allows him to escort her to his door. She returns to Jem's room, and Atticus reads to her until she falls asleep. He tucks her in her own bed and then retreats to Jem's room, where he spends the night. And that is all. Thank you.